Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. Because last Monday's episode, I talked about Kentucky after they lost to Richmond. Wednesday's episode, I talked about Kentucky after they lost to Kansas, and my hope was they played Georgia Tech on Sunday that I would not have to talk about them again. Instead, they lost for the third straight game, and we are talking about them not only because they lost, but because they literally got punked. It was by far the worst loss that they have had of the season. I think you can legitimately make the case it is one of the worst losses of the John Calipari era in general. And for the first time in a long time, the Kentucky fan base is really upset with one of the premier coaches, a Hall of Fame coach, with where this program is and where this program is headed. And so let's start with the game itself, because the bottom line is, again, if it was just another loss, if it's a buzzer beater, you play well, you just run into a better team, that's a lot different than what happened on Sunday. On Sunday, Kentucky played a Georgia Tech team which came into the game 0-2. Now, I'll pseudo-defend Josh Pastner on this because Josh Pastner, friend of the podcast, he decided to do contactless practices before the season, which I don't think was the right move. But I think he quickly realized that, hey, when you're going to play 5-on-5 in games, we got to do 5-on-5 in practices. And so I don't think Georgia Tech is as bad as the 0-2 record would indicate. But I would also say that you can't lose to them if you're Kentucky, and you certainly can't lose to them in the way that you did. The final score was 79-62, but you know what this game was? This was a game where a veteran team full of grown men just punked Kentucky. They were dunking. They were yelling in their face. I saw the big guy Moses Wright say, "Get off my court. This is my court." And as I said on Twitter, what it basically was, you know what it basically was? It was in high school when the nerd gets shoved into the locker. And in this case, the nerd was Kentucky getting shoved into the locker by the older, tougher veteran team in Georgia Tech. And so it's unfortunate, but it's the reality. And like I said, Kentucky fans are about as mad as I have ever seen them because it continues a very disturbing trend over the last couple years. This is the third straight year that this team has really struggled out of the gate. 2 years ago, they get destroyed by Duke on opening night. That was the Zion Williamson, R.J. Barrett game. Kentucky bounces back nicely. They do go to the Elite Eight, P.J. Washington, Tyler Hero, whatever. Last year, you have an embarrassing loss to Evansville at Rupp Arena after you beat Michigan State in the Champions Classic. And then this year, 1-3 with a loss to Richmond, which is a great program, great school. You shouldn't be losing to them if you're Kentucky, though. Kansas, okay, they're a blue blood, but they stink this year. That was a terrible game. As I said on Wednesday's show, neither team deserved to win. Kansas just deserved to lose less. And then you have Sunday against Georgia Tech, where you're playing an 0-2 team and you get destroyed in every way. And I think the problems are real. I think the concerns are real. I do think there are some issues that need to be talked about because a lot of what happened is what on Sunday is what has happened all year. Kentucky really struggled to run any sort of offense. They're struggling at the point guard position. They have way more turnovers than assists, 21 turnovers, 16 assists on Sunday, which is actually a much better percentage than they had against either Kansas or Richmond in the last couple weeks. Don't have pieces that seem to fit, and don't have players that are living up to expectations. Olivier Sarr, who was touted by me as the best transfer on the market this offseason, and I truly believed it at the time, went 1 for 4 against Georgia Tech from the field and played scared. That is indisputable. If you watched it, you saw it. He got punked. Devin Askew, he's a freshman. I'll give him a little bit of a pass, but he was brought in to be the point guard at Kentucky. That is a position that has a lot of responsibility, that was played by John Wall, that was played by De'Aaron Fox, that has been played by many really good players, and when you take on that responsibility, it comes with a burden. Unfortunately, the poor kid isn't living up to it. And it's not that he's a bad kid. It's not that I'm picking on him specifically. But when Georgia Tech went to that 2-3 zone, it felt like the game was too fast for Devin Askew. It felt like every time he caught the ball, he couldn't wait to get rid of it. And if you're the point guard, you got to be better. He finished the game with he finished 1 of 2 shooting from the field with 1 assist and 1 turnover. You got to be better if you're a point guard. Now, there were some positives. The rest of the freshmen, Terrence Clark looked really good. He played probably the best game any freshman at Kentucky has played all year. 22 points for the Wildcats, 3 of 4 shooting from the three-point line. BJ Boston, 11 points, 3 3-pointers made. And Isaiah Jackson's just a monster. He's a kid that plays down low, 9 points and 12 rebounds. And if you are looking for a silver lining, by far the best shooting night that Kentucky has had all year, as they went 8 for 19 from the field. Of course, none of it matters because this team isn't getting better. You could argue they're getting worse. And as I said, this is one of the worst losses of the John Calipari era, I think, indisputably. And I do think that it's fair that while Calipari, I think, does an incredible job, I think he's an incredible coach. I think he's one of the best that I have ever seen. I do think it's fair to start asking some questions after another slow start to another slow season. And I think where I would start by saying is what I always say is like, look, Calipari, he's a legend, right? I'm not here to tear down his whole resume. I'm not here to say that he never, he's overrated and he just rolls the ball out. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is a couple things. First of all, I think there's like a broader, bigger conversation that's maybe for another day about how he just goes about building this roster. Because I do think it's really hard in this era to rely so heavily on the one-and-done high school freshmen, especially when you can't really build a bench out, right? Because first of all, if you're not getting those elite guys, the Zions, the RJs, the Anthony Davises, the Derrick Roses, whoever, you need to have a bench, you need to have depth, and you need to have veterans. But it's hard to keep veterans because they keep getting recruited over. And so you bring in a guy that you want to stay for 2 or 3 years, and it's like, well, that kid wants to know that he's going to have a shot to earn his playing time instead of getting recruited over in the next recruiting class. And so there's probably a broader conversation to have about how the rosters are even being built. And that's probably like a very valid conversation. I also think Calipari's been doing it this way for close to 15 years now, dating back to his time at Memphis, and I don't think it's really going to change. So I think the broader question has to be about this team, how it's coached, how it's managed. And what I'll say is this. I'll say what I said on Twitter. I think 2 things can be true about Calipari. I think on the one hand, we can go ahead and say, well, he's going to figure it out because he's Calipari and he always does. I think that's totally fair, and we'll get into that in a second. I also think it's fair for fans to be frustrated and for fans to say, you're the second highest paid coach in the sport behind Coach K, and he might be first. I don't know. He makes over $8 million a year. He has every resource available to him. He has probably the largest coaching staff in America, multiple support staff members whose job is nothing but to game plan. And they're getting out game plan every single week, every single game. And so I think those 2 things can be true. And I think if there's one broad takeaway that I have about Kentucky at this moment, it's that. We can have the conversation that Kentucky will probably figure it out because Calipari does, but we can also have the conversation of why does a Kentucky fan have to wait to get it figured out, right? Duke doesn't have to wait until February for things to get figured out every year. Kansas doesn't have to wait until February to get things figured out. Virginia, Villanova, Gonzaga, Baylor, on and on and on and on and on. Maybe Baylor's not fair because they're kind of new on the scene, but you get the point. These programs that are good every single year don't have to wait until February to figure it out. North Carolina, by the way, 3 freshmen in their rotation that play huge minutes. Just went to Maui/Asheville. Looked pretty good. They have a couple more veterans, but the point remains. I understand a Kentucky fan that's sitting there saying, like, why do I have to wait until February for my team to be good every year? And so we do have to start with the idea of Calipari always figures it out. And I do think that's an important point, right? Because I want to side 100% with Kentucky fans, but I do think we do need to understand that like this is part of the deal. And whatever you think is going to happen in November, December, January, it does get figured out. Last year, Kentucky did win the SEC. They did go 13-2 down the stretch. As I said, once SEC play hit, they basically played one bad half the entire month of February on. That was against the second half against Tennessee in a game that they were completely dominating. But, they went to Arkansas and won. They went to play Auburn at home and beat Auburn at home. They beat LSU. So like that part can be true. He does figure it out. The year before, you lose to Duke, but you're still in the Elite Eight with a chance to go to the Final Four. 2018, I said it a few episodes ago. P.J. Washington makes a foul shot or two. They're playing Loyola Chicago to go to the Final Four. Year before that, De'Aaron Fox, they should have been in the Final Four. So Calipari does figure it out, and that is an important part of this context. But I also think it's an important part of the context of what I said a minute ago. Calipari gets paid $8 million a year. It's fair to ask, why does it take until February every year? And it can't always be that I'm young. It can't always be that I have a new roster, because guess what? Guess what? Like I said, Kansas has an entirely new roster. Duke has a new roster. By the way, even in your own league, Alabama has a new roster. Alabama has like one or two guys that played last year. They just went to Maui and won 2 games. Arkansas has a new roster. Now, they have an easier schedule, but the schedule's on you. You're the one that makes the schedule. So that's part of it too. And I do think it's fair, and I do think it's fair when you're making $8 million a year, and when you have the biggest support staff in America, and when you have every resource available to you to ask these questions. I would also say some of it goes beyond Calipari and goes to his staff. Never forget, this is, again, probably the biggest support staff in America, best paid support staff in America. What are you guys doing? I looked it up just to make sure. In the last couple years, Kentucky has taken 2 guys out of assistant coaching roles where they would have to go on the road recruiting, do all that kind of stuff, and put them in basketball operations roles only. Tony Barbee and John Robick. I'm not going to sit here and claim I know what they do behind the scenes. But if your job is not to recruit, it means you should be spending all your time on game planning and on player development, and that clearly isn't happening, at least not at the rate that you need it to happen. I would say this, the 3 coaches that are allowed to recruit, they're young, they're ambitious, they're hungry. I get it, except for Bruiser Flint, who's veteran. But the coaches that are mostly recruiters, they can't go on the road right now. It's not like they're gone once the games finish and they come in for the games only. They can't leave campus. They can't go on the road to recruit. So they should be, I don't want to say they should be doing this or that. What I am saying is there is no reason that this team should be this bad when all of the coaching staff is in Lexington, and this is one of the biggest, most well-paid coaching staffs going forward. Now, all I'll say is that as weird as it sounds, like I do think it is going to get figured out. Like, first of all, that Georgia Tech game before it got blown open was there for the taking. Kansas was there for the taking, and this team just hasn't taken it. I do think there are some bright spots. Terrence Clark, like I said, played by far the best game any Kentucky player has played all year. Davion Mintz, I think, has actually been good. Wasn't great on Saturday. Problem with him is he's better playing off the ball, and they're basically needing him, to play on the ball. But I think he's pretty good. Isaiah Jackson is a total revelation. I think you could argue he has been the biggest surprise in college basketball this year. So there are positives. And the funny thing is, I actually think it's going to get figured out. But I also don't think it's unfair for fans saying, dude, you make $8 million a year. I don't always want to hear how we're young. I don't always want to hear how we need time, how we got to figure it out, how we're starting over from scratch, because there's a lot of programs that do that, and there's a lot of programs that aren't getting blown out by Georgia Tech early on in the season.